Hey everyone! Let me take you back to a time of rebellion, drama, and intense warfare in the Roman Empire. Today we're diving into an incredible chapter of ancient history called the Great Illyrian Revolt, also known as the Bellum Batonianum, or the War of the Batos. This was no small uprising. It was a fierce and prolonged conflict fought in the Roman province of Illyricum during the 1st century, where the local tribes decided they had had enough of Roman domination. It all kicked off when native warriors, who had been forced to serve as auxiliaries in the Roman army, decided to revolt. These weren't just random groups either. This rebellion was led by two powerful leaders, who coincidentally shared the same name. There was Bato the Daesitiate, a chieftain from what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Bato the Breucian, who hailed from the Breuci tribe in Pannonia. Soon, other tribes across Illyria joined the uprising, forming an alliance that shook the Roman Empire to its core. The Romans called this rebellion the Batonian War, named after these two Batos, but it's also referred to as the Pannonian-Dalmatian uprising, or the Great Illyrian Revolt. And trust me, it lived up to those names. The war lasted for 4 long years, from AD 6 to AD 9, and forced Rome to deploy massive armies across the Western Balkans. They fought battles on multiple fronts, dealing with guerrilla tactics that pushed their military to its limits. By AD 8, one part of the rebellion crumbled when the Breuci tribe surrendered, but the fighting in Dalmatia raged on for another year. The Roman historian Suetonius even claimed that this was the toughest conflict Rome had faced since their epic wars with Carthage centuries earlier. And if you know anything about Roman history, that's saying something. Interestingly, the rebellion wasn't just about fighting. There was betrayal too. Bato the Breucian turned on Pinnes, a local leader who the Romans later backed as ruler of the Breuci tribe. It's like something straight out of a historical drama. And let's not forget the backstory to all this. Illyricum had been a turbulent region for decades. Back during the Roman Civil War, when Julius Caesar and Pompey clashed, the locals had already made their mark. While some Roman towns along the coast supported Caesar, the native tribes sided with Pompey. Even after Caesar's victory, the region didn't settle down. Pirates from Dalmatia harassed Roman ships, and tribes like the Eopides carried out bold raids into Roman territories. Rome retaliated fiercely, with generals like Octavian, who would later become Emperor Augustus, leading campaigns to crush the resistance and expand Roman control deeper into Pannonia. This uneasy peace didn't last. Over the years, rebellions flared up again and again, keeping Roman armies busy. The native tribes were skilled fighters, often using guerrilla warfare and exploiting the rugged terrain to their advantage. Despite Rome's superior resources and organized legions, the Illyrians proved to be a relentless thorn in their side. It all built up to this colossal uprising, the Great Illyrian Revolt, where for the first time, these tribes united against their common enemy. They had learned from the Romans too. Many of the rebels had previously served in Roman auxiliary units, which meant they knew Roman tactics inside out. But instead of fighting conventional battles, they relied on hit-and-run tactics and ambushes, keeping the Romans constantly on edge. And in AD 6, things were heating up in the Roman province of Illyricum. Tiberius, the Roman general and heir to Augustus, was preparing for a major campaign against the Marcomanni in Germania. But just as he was about to proceed, chaos erupted in Illyricum. The local tribes had been ordered to provide auxiliary troops for the Roman army, but instead of joining forces, they turned their weapons on Rome. It all started with a Daesitiate chieftain named Bato, a clever and determined leader who wasn't about to let Rome exploit his people without consequence. Bato rallied his followers and struck a decisive blow, defeating the Roman force sent to suppress them. His victory quickly drew more tribes to his cause, sparking what would become a full-blown rebellion. Notably, the Breuci tribe, under another leader also named Bato, joined the fight. The two Batos, one Dalmatian, one Breucian, formed a formidable alliance that shook the foundations of Roman authority in the region. The scale of the rebellion was staggering. Ancient sources like Valus Paterculus claimed that the rebels numbered 200,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, with a total population exceeding 800,000. While these figures might be exaggerated, they give a sense of how massive and coordinated the uprising was. The rebels had knowledge of Roman military tactics, a result of many of them having served in Roman auxiliary forces. This familiarity with the enemy's strategies gave them a dangerous edge. The insurgents wasted no time implementing their plans. They divided their forces into 3 groups, each with a specific target. One contingent set its sights on Italy, making its way toward the Roman fort of Nauportus, located in present-day Slovenia. Another marched into Macedonia, wreaking havoc in the region, while the third stayed in their home territories to continue the fight. Their movements were swift and devastating, leaving Roman settlements in flames and spreading panic as far as Rome itself. Augustus, the Roman emperor, was alarmed. He called for emergency measures, including a general levy and even the conscription of freedmen, a move so desperate it hadn't been used since the aftermath of Rome's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Cannae centuries earlier. Tiberius, who had to abandon his campaign in Germania, was tasked with leading the Roman counteroffensive. He quickly organized the Roman forces, employing a strategy to outmaneuver the rebels and disrupt their plans. One of his immediate challenges was the siege of Sirmium, a vital Roman city in Pannonia. Aulus Caecina Severus, the governor of Mysia, stepped in with reinforcements and managed to repel the Breuci near the river Drava. It was a hard-fought battle, with heavy losses on both sides. Meanwhile, the Dalmatian forces under Bato attempted to seize Salona, a key Roman port on the Adriatic coast. Despite suffering a defeat and injury in battle, Bato was relentless, sending his men to raid the coast as far south as Apollonia. The 2 Batos eventually joined forces, further solidifying the rebellion's strength. They occupied Mount Alma, a strategically important location, but were met by Thracian cavalry under Metalces, an ally of the Romans. The clash was fierce, and while the rebels fought valiantly, they couldn't maintain their position. Nevertheless, they remained a thorn in Rome's side, constantly moving and avoiding open battles. Tiberius, recognizing the futility of chasing them in the mountains, resorted to a war of attrition. His forces ravaged the countryside, cutting off the rebels' supplies and forcing them into defensive positions. The situation grew more complicated when the rebels launched a second invasion of Macedonia. This time, the Thracian allies of Rome, led by Metalces and his brother Rasiporus, managed to fend them off. However, the repeated incursions into Macedonia highlighted the rebels' ability to strike across a broad front, keeping the Romans stretched thin. By AD 7, the prolonged nature of the war was beginning to draw criticism back in Rome. Augustus, frustrated by the lack of progress, sent Tiberius's nephew Germanicus to take command in Illyricum. But this wasn't a reflection of Tiberius's capabilities. In fact, his strategy of counterinsurgency and scorched earth tactics was proving effective, though slow. Germanicus arrived with reinforcements, including contingents of freedmen and freemen requisitioned from their masters in Rome. Despite this, Rome faced internal challenges, including a grain shortage, which added pressure to bring the conflict to an end. As the Roman forces tightened their grip, the rebel army began to falter. Starvation and exhaustion set in, and their inability to engage in direct confrontations left them vulnerable. One of their key defeats came in the Claudian Mountains, where they took up a defensive position but were ultimately overpowered by the Roman legions. The war continued with skirmishes and raids, but the tide was turning in favor of Rome. Tiberius, Germanicus, and their combined forces worked methodically to reclaim territory and dismantle the rebellion. It was a grueling campaign, marked by harsh winters, difficult terrain, and fierce resistance. Yet, step by step, the Roman army pushed the rebels back. And now let's talk about the final stages of the rebellion in Pannonia during AD 8. After years of devastating conflict, it seemed like the end was in sight for the rebellious tribes of Dalmatia and Pannonia. The relentless fighting, combined with famine and disease, had taken its toll on the rebel forces. By AD 8, many of the tribes, particularly the Dalmatians and Pannonians, were on the verge of giving up. They were starved and exhausted, and some of them were eager to negotiate peace. But the hardline rebels, led by figures like Bato, were determined to resist. They knew that surrendering to Rome would likely mean their annihilation, so they pushed on despite the hardships. Tiberius, following his policy of scorched earth tactics, had effectively starved the region into submission. By cutting off the rebels' food supply, he forced them into a corner. Roman historian Cassius Dio mentions that this year saw grain shortages in Rome as well, which added further strain to the empire's supply lines. While it's unclear just how widespread the famine was in the Mediterranean, it likely contributed to the rebels' desperation. However, despite the tough conditions, Bato the Breucian, another key rebel leader, managed to topple the local king Pinus. Bato's suspicions about his own people and their loyalty led him to demand hostages from the Breuci garrisons, but his control soon faltered. In a battle, Bato the Daesitiate defeated him, and Pinus was executed. The fall of Pinus triggered a shift in loyalty among the Pannonian tribes. Many of them broke away from the rebellion and stopped fighting. Meanwhile, the Romans, under Marcus Plautius Silvanus, managed to conquer the Breuci tribe and convince many other tribes to lay down their arms without further bloodshed. The rebellion, it seemed, was fracturing. Bato the Daesitiate, who had once commanded a united front, found himself pushed out of Pannonia. He retreated to Dalmatia, hoping to regroup and maintain his resistance there, but his power was slipping. Tiberius wasn't about to let up. He pursued Bato relentlessly, and by the harsh winter of AD 8, the Pannonians were forced to seek peace. The war-weary tribes gathered at the river Bathinus to surrender. Bato, though still defiant, was eventually captured. With his surrender, and that of the other rebel leaders, it seemed like the rebellion was finally over. But the devastation didn't end there. By AD 9, the conflict had dwindled to its final chapter, confined to Dalmatia. This is where the last pockets of resistance remained, and the Romans weren't going to let their guard down just yet. Augustus entrusted the command of Roman forces to Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Lepidus made his way through areas untouched by the war, and swiftly defeated fresh local forces who had hoped to join the resistance. After ravaging the fields and burning homes, he joined up with Tiberius, signaling the final stages of the campaign. However, there were still some stubborn holdouts in Dalmatia. Tiberius led the charge, splitting the Roman army into 3 divisions to prevent any chance of mutiny. This strategy paid off, as the Romans crushed their enemies. The final battles were bitter and fought with determination. Bato, now on the run, was cornered in the fortress of Adetrium, near Salona. The site was a natural stronghold surrounded by steep ravines, which made it a tough target for the Romans. But Tiberius, knowing that Bato would never give up easily, laid siege to the fortress, refusing to retreat despite the difficult terrain. Bato attempted to negotiate a truce, but his allies refused to accept it. As Tiberius's forces pressed forward, the Dalmatians tried to use the rugged terrain to their advantage, throwing stones and forcing the Romans into disarray. But Tiberius, ever the strategist, reinforced his men continuously and sent a detachment through a longer, less obvious route. Once that point was taken, the rebels had no choice but to flee into the forest, where most of them were eventually hunted down and killed. At the same time, Germanicus, Tiberius's nephew, was dealing with the last pockets of resistance in the town of Arduba. This town was well fortified, surrounded by a river, and fiercely defended. However, there was tension within the rebel ranks. Some deserters wanted to continue fighting, while others, mainly the women, wanted peace, fearing what would come next for them if the Romans won. This internal conflict eventually led to violence, and the deserters were defeated. The women, in a desperate act of defiance, threw themselves into the flames or the river, choosing death over submission. With Arduba falling, Germanicus rejoined Tiberius, and they sent Gaius Vibius Postumus to subdue the last remaining rebellious districts. It wasn't long before Bato, realizing that there was no escape, promised to surrender. Tiberius, ever pragmatic, agreed, but he couldn't help but ask why the rebellion had started in the first place. Bato's reply was blunt. "You Romans are to blame for this. For you send as guardians of your flocks, not dogs or shepherds but wolves." With Bato's capture, the rebellion was officially over. Rome, however, had paid a heavy price. The brutal tactics employed during the war, burning crops, destroying villages, and scattering families, left deep scars on the land. The Romans then set about dividing and reordering the Illyrian tribes, breaking them into smaller groups to prevent future uprisings. Some tribes were sold into slavery or deported, while others were resettled far from their homeland. The aftermath of the war left a region broken and scattered, but it also solidified Rome's control over Pannonia and Dalmatia, marking the end of one of the most challenging rebellions faced by the Roman Empire during this period. The scars of the war would remain for many, but for the Romans, it was another victory in their long campaign to expand and maintain their dominance across the empire.